Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Now we're going to have a discussion, myself and Amos Zweig, a discussion slash debate, if you want to call it that, about miracles, what miracles are, its nature, things connected to that, and also the issue of worldviews and axioms and philosophical principles more broadly, because these things can be sort of talked about in light of the other issue, and they are related. Because when it comes to miracles, it is a controversial issue. Many people deny even the existence of miracles themselves. Others, like myself, would maintain that they are true and we can have knowledge about them. And almost would perhaps be more skeptical about that. We're going to have a discussion about that. And also, yes, axioms are relevant. If someone has the axiom of miracles do not occur, then obviously he's not going to take into account arguments for miracles with that axiom in mind. So axioms and principles will be very relevant to this discussion. So Amos, what do you think about perhaps starting with defining miracles and go from there?
Yes, good idea. Good idea. Um, yes, I guess already here we have to take into consideration this idea of worldviews. And so I will present two possible definitions of the term miracle, and one of which I believe to be possible, and the other of which I do not believe to be possible. And so we will see where this goes. So certain people define a miracle, certain people define a miracle as some event that happens that defies the laws of nature. So let's say we all know that gravity exists, but for example, in the Quran, I think Muhammad, in the end of his life, he kind of flew up into the sky or something like that. Or also, I think the prophet Elijah flew up into the sky. And so that would be some event that kind of defies the laws of nature. And this is how some people define a miracle. And this is what I do not believe to be possible, because I have never experienced in my life any phenomenon that that defied what we call the laws of nature, like scientifically speaking. And I think we call them laws of nature because they have so far never been observed to be broken, or at least you have to very sincerely question people who say that they have been broken. So that would be one way to define miracle. And another way to define miracle would be from the point of view of the individual as it is going through life. So if you define reality as not as objective material stuff that interacts, but as kind of your experience as you exist, that which you experience, that is reality, then of course miracles are possible. So some people will say, I have been in a very bad state in my life. I don't know, not me, this is just a hypothetical example. I was alcoholic, I was thinking about suicide. And then just I met this person on the street by accident, and they were very kind, and they opened up again my belief in something positive. And so they would describe meeting this person as a miracle that saved them. And this kind of miracle I believe to be possible, but this doesn't defy the laws of nature. So I guess that would be my start.
So I would say that miracles, as I would define them, would be somewhat different. It would be that the natural operation or natural activity that flows from the nature of a thing is suspended by a higher power that has the power to do so, which would in the end only be God, but that could be discussed further later perhaps. So it's natural activity or natural operation which naturally flows from the nature of a thing, and that being suspended, being interfered with and suspended by a higher power with the power to do that. And when it comes to what is natural activity, natural operation, well, it's sort of it's what it sort of says in the words themselves, that it is some way that things behave if left to themselves and their own nature. For instance, it is the nature of anything material, let's just say a stone, is such that it will, when left to its own power, behave in such a way that it will behave in a way that we would call following the laws of gravity, being drawn to the earth, etc. And you could say that about many things. And an apple which has fallen down from the apple tree and is no longer connected to the root will eventually die and rot away, because that's how it's going. That's what it's going to do, naturally speaking. But it's always the qualification that that is how things operate naturally when left to themselves. So there is this inherent possibility, metaphysical possibility, of that natural behavior being interfered with and interrupted and suspended by something higher. And we can find analogies to this in human life, you might say. For instance, yes, the stone is naturally behaving such that it will be drawn towards the earth, gravity, but we could prevent that by holding the stone in our hand and lifting it up. That wouldn't be a miracle, of course, because that's not a supernatural interference, but it's just an analogy to illustrate the point that something can interfere with how things would otherwise, by their own power, operate. Or water flowing down from a river at the top of a mountain, and it goes down the mountain and flows in that river. If left to its own power without interference by something other than that, then it will just go down the mountainside. But then you can have not only humans but other animals preventing that by putting up dams and things like that. So that would be an analogy to miracles. So it wouldn't be then, I would say, something that defies or contradicts or violates the laws of nature, because the laws of nature, how things naturally behave, is how they would behave provided there is no higher power interfering with that behavior. So it's always under that qualification, and therefore it opens the door to the possibility of miracles. So what do you think about this?
Yeah, I think that's pretty close to, well, we have to qualify, because as you said, of course, a human being can take a stone and throw it up a mountainside, which the stone wouldn't do if it's left to itself. Now you can ask, from the point of view of the stone, if that makes any sense, is this a miracle? But the stone doesn't really have a point of view, so I guess that the question is kind of futile. So, and here we come back to the problem of the point of view. So when we speak from our point of view, whether or not something is a miracle, then there would have to be some kind of being or entity which is on a higher plane than we are, that interferes in the way we normally experience reality. That's, I think, what you are saying, right?
Right, it would require that when upon further analysis.
Yes, because all the things that we know in material reality, when they just act in a certain kind of way, then we wouldn't upon your definition, call this a miracle. So, for example, let's say I'm standing someplace, and close to me, like a building explodes, and just pieces of concrete and iron fly all over the place, but somehow none of them hits me. So I'm perfectly unharmed, even though all around me stones and iron pieces have fallen to the ground. So this isn't a miracle necessarily in your definition, because there is a certain probability that that's just how the explosion took place. So there is, we can explain this phenomenon using just the behavior of matter. So that wouldn't be a miracle from your point of view, right?
No, if it is possible that it was a purely natural explanation, if that could explain the phenomena, it wouldn't be a miracle, properly speaking.
Yes, or maybe better example, there is this funny cartoon where a guy stands in a place and the wall of a building falls onto him, but he stands exactly in the place where a window is, and so he is left unharmed.
Yes, Charlie Chaplin, I think that was.
Yeah, for example, exactly. So I guess that wouldn't then be a miracle, it would just be good luck, or it would be a miracle in the way of my second definition, like from the point of view of the individual, could say, wow, that was really like a miracle. I have survived this terrible accident, or if someone survives a plane crash or something like that. But it wouldn't be a miracle from your definition. And yeah.
Yeah, right. It wouldn't necessarily mean that God would not have made that happen by some special power or providence. But yes, it wouldn't be a miracle, strictly speaking, where we could show this is suspending the natural behavior of things. No.
Yes, and so I guess your definition of a miracle is very similar to my first definition, which I said that I don't believe happens. And of course, we come exactly very quickly to the underlying axiom or worldview, that you assume that there is a certain kind of being, which you call God, which has certain attributes that allow this being to suspend what I call the laws of nature, or how things operate when this being doesn't intervene. And I don't really believe that that is the case. And so that's why I wouldn't think that this is possible, such a miracle as you have defined it, but you would think that it is.
Right. Well, then I would ask, for instance, whether you would say that things must by absolute necessity operate naturally, i.e., that it would be impossible for there to be a higher being with the power to suspend that, or simply that you are open to the idea, but you haven't seen any evidence of there being such a higher being that actually does that. So what would you describe your view as in light of that?
Yes, I think it's the second case. I just, from my experience of the world, I cannot derive the belief that there is such a being that can do this, but I cannot absolutely prove that there isn't. This is like this theist idea that, well, there might be a God that is all powerful and he could intervene at any point in the course of the world, but he simply chooses not to do so. And how should I know that this, I cannot prove that this is not the case. I just think as long as he doesn't intervene, then I can just as well assume that he doesn't exist. It's like the easier hypothesis. But if, for example, I don't know, some person around me would just, like, he would be shot and his head would explode, and then it would kind of come back together and he would stand up again and be alive again. That would really make me question all these axioms that I hold at the moment. So I would be open to have this worldview challenged, but so far there hasn't been any reason that made me that convinced me otherwise.
Well, in that case, I would say then that with that openness to there might be miracles, but I haven't seen anyone yet, then one could point out that, well, there actually has been well-attested miracles. So that would then be the very relevant and valuable point to be made there. Actually, I remembered a good example that is sort of a little bit like those hypothetical examples you mentioned there. The Hiroshima 4. I'm not sure if you ever heard about them. There were 4 Catholic priests in the 1940s who lived in Hiroshima in Japan, and then the atomic bomb fell in Hiroshima, and they were extremely close to that bomb when it hit, but they were not particularly injured. Everything around them was basically broken down to ashes, and all human beings within that region were killed instantly. But they just had some very minor injuries to the body. They weren't particularly injured in a major way in any way. And scientists looked at that and said that that's scientifically impossible. So that would be an example of a miracle in modern times, actually, that would be well documented. And there are many others which we could talk about, but that's an example of something like that. And then you have, the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, which is perhaps the most famous, which would be attested historically in well-attested sources. That's also something that would be related to religion as well, just so that's mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, we have had a little discussion in one of our live streams about the resurrection of Jesus and whether that's a historical fact or more to be understood as a part of a story, so to make a moral point, which is what I believe. But this example of these 4 Catholic priests, I have never heard of it. It seems quite crazy to me. I would also think that seems impossible to survive this kind of like a nuclear bomb while everything else around you is destroyed. Yeah, we get into a big problem here, which is, and this is a better example in my mind than the Jesus example, because it is far more recent. Because when something is said to have happened 2,000 years ago, even if it was well attested at that time, I cannot relate to the worldview and the language use and all these kinds of things, like, because many people today assume that when a person in the Middle East 2,000 years ago said a certain word or a certain sentence, and these words have been written down and kept for 2,000 years, that he meant what we mean today when we read this sentence. But I think this assumption is quite it's quite unsure whether this is actually the case, because the use of language changes over time, and the use of images to describe certain things changes over time, and so that's very difficult. And this other example with these 4 priests was quite more recently, and so, for example, if there were some Americans or some people who have actually witnessed this and then written about it, then I could better understand or be more certain that I understand what they meant with what they wrote. And yeah, still it's a big problem, because one problem is what source do you trust when it comes to the telling of stories? Because we all know that people also lie. People make up stories to gain attention, to gain monetary benefits for all kinds of reasons. I mean, everybody knows that people lie in certain cases. So there's a question of trust in such eyewitness accounts, because of course I wasn't there myself. And the second problem is then, which we could address later, is the logical consistency of the theory being presented. Let's leave that for later.
Well, many things to be said there. We could go perhaps into the historical documents of what happened 2,000 years ago. That would be, I would have many things to respond to that. But yes, when it comes to the more recent things, well, when it comes to the Hiroshima 4 issue, that's very well, you could say, attested, because not only do you have the 4 priests, but you also have scientific experts who actually investigated the whole issue and found that conclusion that I described to be true. So I can send you an article about it, of course, which would go more into detail. There's also a photography where you can see them in the middle of the place, etc. So there are multiple things that also are worth mentioning. And also there are other well-attested miracles, because to go back to principal issues, it's true that there is the issue of reliable sources or reliable witnesses. If you simply heard that someone heard that someone heard that someone heard that someone heard that once upon a time there was a miracle, you could say, well, that's somewhat weak. But when you have people who are multiple people attesting to the same fact, there are other facts which testify to that, etc. And if they're publicly attested, like a public fact, that would be very strong, and there are many such cases. Another very famous example, one of the most famous, is the miracle of the sun at Fatima in Portugal in 1917, which was actually a miracle that was predicted beforehand to take place at the specific date, October the 17th, at the specific time of that date. And there were a lot of people who traveled there. Over 70,000 people traveled to that particular spot because there was predicted to be a miracle there. Because there were three little children who reported to have met the Blessed Virgin Mary in Fatima, and they asked her for a sign to show others that this was actually happening. It was not simply a fairy story; it was actually happening. And then that the Blessed Mother told the children there was going to be this miracle at this particular date, etc. So people came, more than 70,000, a lot of people, and then you had the miracle of the sun, where the sun started to make completely unnatural moves in the sky, literally dancing alongside in the sky, which of course is scientifically impossible. It changed colors, and then it began to zoom in upon the earth. So people thought that it was the end of the world. And it was raining when the miracle happened, but then just 2 minutes afterward, the very wet clothes were completely dry, and that's scientifically impossible in that short amount of time. So that's a very, very brief presentation of the miracle of the sun. And that's, again, a publicly attested miracle with tens of thousands watching. So that's another example of such miracles that are well attested.
Yeah, so you basically addressed the problem of trust in the source, right? When you said that when just some person has heard of some person who has heard, etc., then it's reasonable to doubt these accounts. But when kind of something happened in public and was viewed by very many people, then it's it's very difficult, or it's not so reasonable to just deny the experience of all of these people. And I guess I would have to agree with this statement, because this would actually be the basis of the scientific method, that if a phenomenon is observable by many people, then this adds to the credibility of this observation. So we still have the problem of repeatability, that typically science describes things that are repeatable. So any scientific experiment, you should be able to repeat it again, and it should lead to the same result. And this is, of course, a big barrier for any scientifically minded person to accept this idea of a miracle, because these occurrences are typically not repeatable. But just the first thought that went through my mind is, if you have some weird pressure phenomenon going on in the atmosphere, then you could, in theory, create this optical illusion that the sun is moving in kind of weird patterns over the sky. Because when the density of air is not homogeneous, then it might distort the way things are seen. And over a long distance, this could create all kinds of special effects. And so I guess one problem is also, and this is, I think, in general, a problem that I have a little bit with these kinds of accounts, is that Christians, and maybe also other religious peoples, but I have most experience of this with Christians, whenever they see some phenomenon that they can't explain, they immediately jump up and say, now we have proof of a miracle and God exists, and my whole theory of the way the world and the cosmos works is now proven. But that's not necessarily true. Sometimes it is also just the case that you have observed a phenomenon and you cannot explain it yet. And this is something that scientists admit all the time. They say, well, we have observed this weird phenomenon, we cannot explain it, and so we will try to start to explain it. So when, and I think that's a big problem in this discussion, but probably it also goes back to the original assumption that the scientist assumes there is matter and energy that behave in a certain predictable way, and if we observe a weird phenomenon, we just haven't understood yet how it happens. But that doesn't mean that it's a miracle. That just means we haven't understood yet how it happens. So I guess that's a problem with many of these so-called miracles. Also, clothes drying in 2 minutes. I don't know what the conditions of the atmosphere were at that place in time. Like, that's just, it seems to me, that's not something which I would consider directly impossible according to the laws of nature. So it would be perhaps something else if you would dip a piece of cloth into water and it would just not get wet. Then you would have to ask, why isn't it getting wet? And maybe it would be impregnated, but if it were just perfect cloth and perfect water and the water wouldn't be soaked into the cloth, then that would seem to me to contradict the nature of these two entities.
Well, yes, the clothes of those people, they couldn't dry in such a short time, and there was actually a scientist investigating that issue and concluded that for all those clothes to be dry in that amount of time, you would need an atomic bomb in the middle, or at least a bomb that is extremely explosive But of course, there wasn't a bomb explode because everyone would be killed, and that didn't happen. But that would be the equivalent of what would be necessary for that to happen naturally. So that would also attest to supernatural interference. Now, the issue about Christians believing miracles. Well, it is not the case that Christians in general would have this naive view that, oh, it must necessarily be a miracle, whatever we see something mysterious. Actually, the Catholic Church has always had a relatively skeptical approach to miracle claims. Whenever they canonize saints, there are many miracle claims, but they have to investigate it before making a judgment. You have examples of bishops who hear of miracle claims but say, well, you have to have better evidence than that. So the Catholic Church is actually quite cautious in determining whether a miracle has happened or not before a miracle gets approved. So the issue rather for Christians who and everyone should think rationally in the sense that, well, they are presented with some phenomena and try to think of, well, what would be the reasonable explanation here? If there is a natural explanation, then we could go with a natural explanation. But when we see something that cannot be explained naturally, which actually contradict how nature would operate on its own, then we would have a rational basis for a miracle. To the issue of repeatability, it's true that miracles cannot be repeated, but just because something cannot be repeated, like in physics, doesn't mean that it's unreasonable to believe it happened. History operates that way. When we know of wars happening, or that George Washington and John Adams existed as historical persons involved in the American Revolutionary War, to take an example, you cannot repeat those individuals existing today and doing what they did, but it's rather we know that they existed because we have all these reliable sources that tell us about it. Now, it's true, you could say that, well, wars happen over and over again and people exist over and over again. True, but not that particular war or that particular person. So certain aspects of an event can be believed even though those aspects in themselves cannot be repeated. So, and also even scientific examples, people who would believe that, well, this is how the solar system formed, or the world was created by Big Bang, even though I don't believe in Big Bang or that. But people who believe that would also say that, well, that event cannot be happening again. So again, I don't believe in Big Bang, but that's just an example of how people could believe even scientific facts, or what they claim is scientific facts. I don't claim that. And that would be unrepeatable. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, good point. And of course, you are right that things that are not repeatable happen all the time. And the idea, as like you said, all these examples that you said, I would agree, they happened and they are not repeatable. So the idea of a scientific theory is, of course, not to explain something. Like, science always looks at reality and tries to abstract out the general principles that do repeat over time. So, for example, the way human beings come into the world is when their parents have sex and then they are born. That is repeatable. Now, the individual that actually is born is, of course, not repeatable. So, but that's why, for example, at least for now, we do not have any scientific theory about how an individual comes to be who he is. We just say that's not something that we can explain scientifically, but we can explain how new people come into the world. So I guess this would kind of mean that miracles can, the way we have described them so far, they couldn't actually be a proper field of scientific inquiry by definition, because if they have to do with things that occurred that are not repeatable, then they cannot, by definition, be scientifically understood. So they would be something which is outside of the realm of scientific explanation. And of course, we have to say that many things in our lives or in reality are outside the realm of scientific explanation. And so if we would, but okay, so that's one part. And then, but the second part is the claim that the natural operation of things has been suspended. So I guess, and that's then what you would call a miracle. It's not just the fact that you, Christoffer, exist right now, but you are not repeatable. That's not a miracle. But for example, the idea that Jesus was born of a virgin, that would be a miracle exactly because it contradicts the normally observed way of how people come into the world. Would that be fair to say?
Yes, there's a difference between miracle claims that are not repeatable and other claims which are naturally explained but not repeatable, if that's what you mean.
Yes.
Right, yes. So the point which would be relevant then in that case is that you can believe things rationally that are not repeatable, and thus that cannot the lack of repeatability cannot be used as a critique against the existence of miracles, since we believe other things without repeatability.
Yes. It would just mean that this phenomenon, if it truly is not repeatable, then science cannot explain it.
If you define science in this narrow way of physical, observable, repeatable experiments, some perhaps would define science in a much broader way. So it depends a bit on what you mean by science.
How would you define science in a more broader way?
Generally, the study of reality, perhaps some would say, because you could say that, well, miracles, by studying miracles, you are studying how God interacts with the world, and that could be described as a certain aspect of reality being studied. It's true, it's not a repeatable aspect, but it could be defined that way. So I don't have very much necessarily. I mean, you could define science one way or another way. I tend to like more the broader way of defining science, but the point is that the narrow way of understanding science, as strictly speaking, physical, observable, repeatable experiments, that's only one of several ways of understanding reality.
That's only one of several ways of understanding reality, I would agree, but I think this is the way that we call science or scientific. I would quite strongly oppose this broader definition which you have introduced, because yeah, I think that's not what most people mean when they say that something is a science. And I guess it's even a little bit akin to trying to steal the credibility of this word science, which science has built up over the last couple of 100 years by rigorous work and a very impressive achievements, and trying to steal this credibility and give it to your very unscientific and superstitious or whatever, at least not scientific theories. And so I'm quite opposed to this, but I guess that's not the topic of this conversation.
And just a brief response I would give to that is that science has meant different things or multiple things. For instance, St. Thomas Aquinas speaks of theology as the sacred science, and the very word science means knowledge. It's Latin scientia, knowledge, and people have defined it as a body of knowledge or corpus of knowledge, if you want. So Yes, when I think about that, I wouldn't define science in this very strict way, and it's false to say that science, the term, has always been understood merely the very physical repeatable, because it has been used in this more broadly way. But yeah.
Yeah, but that's actually a good point. And I agree with you that it hasn't always been used in this way, but that's the way it is used today in our society. And this this just goes to show that when Thomas Aquinas spoke of science, he used the same word, but it didn't mean the same thing as we mean today when we speak of science. And so when we read his texts, we not only have to know just how to read the letters, but we also have to know how was this term used in this time? What did it mean actually? Because the term itself does not convey the meaning directly to us. The meaning is something which kind of exists distributed in a society in the way the language is used. And so that's exactly what I meant, that it's problematic to read, for example, the Bible, which is 2,000 years old, so like 4 times as old as Thomas Aquinas, or at least 2 times as old, and then say, here it says this, and this means this, and therefore now I know what these people have observed.
Well, multiple things to be said there. When it comes to how the term science is used today, well, I would like to change it if people mean only the, strictly speaking, physical observable, because it's more in line with the term and the origin of the term and everything, to define it more broadly. And especially since today science is viewed as very sacred in a way, because people think that, if it's scientific, it must be true, and if it's unscientific, it must be false or unreliable. So it seems like science has become this very what can you say, sacred discipline. And if you sort of present things which are not scientific, well, it's not really something to take into account. This logical, positivistic, or scientistic view of the world, that science is the only reliable way we can gain knowledge of the world. That's simply false. So I would like this word science to be changed. But to your other point about the Bible, the thing about the Bible is that we read what they said and we can study their genre. Uh, some books are biography, some books are poetry, like the Psalms. Some books are predictions about the future, like Apocalypse, the book of Apocalypse. And just as we study other ancient historical sources, and we can see that, wow, now they're talking about real life historical events, and now they're talking about poetry, we can make that distinctions relatively easy in many cases. We can do that with the Bible as well, just as when we read Tacitus, the Roman historian. He writes of the history of Rome, and he writes of probably a lot of different wars that were going on. We can easily identify that now he's talking about a war that happened that year in that place. And similarly, we can see when we read the Bible when it's talking about real life historical events and when it's not.
Yeah, I would challenge that notion that you can be so sure as you are about these things. I would really challenge that. I think people today tend to think that, and perhaps that was true at every point in time, people tend to think that all other people look at reality the same way that they look at reality. But that isn't necessarily true. There is, for example, we tend to look at history like a very like a description of things that actually took place in this way as it is said. So if it says, I don't know, this person named John invented the fishing hook, then there was actually a person named John which invented the fishing hook. But there is an interesting case that in prehistoric cultures, they didn't use history like this at all, but they just compressed all the important things that happened in their culture in the past into one person who was kind of the culture hero, who invented the fishing hook and the fire and whatever, the spear thrower, and how to make a canoe. While in reality, this development probably took place over, I don't know, a couple of 10,000 years. But it's not particularly of use to have a detailed record of history. It's much more just to keep the knowledge of these things which are actually relevant to you in the present. And so that's a different way of keeping the history of a culture than we are used today. But many people today assume, oh, of course, these people did history in the same way that we do it today, but I don't think that this necessarily has to be the case. So yeah, I think it's problematic, and I think it would be better if people weren't so sure that they know exactly how this was meant when it was written a very long time ago.
But wouldn't you agree that Roman historian Tacitus, we can see when he's writing about the war happening there and then, for instance?
Let me give you a counterexample. I have at some point started to listen to Plutarch's Lives of Great Romans and Greeks as an audiobook. I haven't progressed very far, but I have listened to, I think, 6 or 7 of them. So, for example, he describes the life of Romulus, the founder of Rome. And he describes this. It's so funny when you listen to this story, because he describes many things which I would believe to be mythology as if they happened in reality. Like these people did this and that. But then on the other hand, sometimes he says, and this source says that Romulus single-handedly killed, I don't know, 3,000 men in this battle. But I think this has to be banished to the realm of mythology. So when Plutarch describes, when he writes, he describes certain things as mythology and others as reality or as history. But some of the things which he describes as history, I'm not an expert, but it seems to me that they are also more in the realm of mythology. So it's just not that simple, I think. And I haven't read Tacitus, so I can't answer this question.
Well, multiple things I would say. First, I mean, some of the things could be classified simply as legends, because of course that happened, that some people that there were legends that developed, and those legends describe things that one would be not exactly expecting to be happening. But I mean, one could then look at historical sources and say, okay, is this reliable by different criteria? And look upon, okay, is this legend, or can we trust this as historically accurate? And second, when I haven't read Plutarch myself, but when he's talking about some guy killing 3,000 men, well, perhaps some could say, well, perhaps they had some other men, but they weren't counted. Or perhaps some would say, well, he was only alone. So I would have to check that context out more in that case. But I mean, in some cases, it's very easy to see that here we can find valuable historical information. Just as we know about the conquest of Alexander the Great, we can know that through different biographers who wrote about his life, and historians would trust that and look upon that as giving us historical information about what really happened in his lifetime. And I think you would agree with that.
Yeah, but here there is a reason why people don't necessarily trust historical sources. They always compare them with archaeological findings, because archaeological findings are like facts that we can make sure ourselves today. So if we find a certain piece of a broken ceramic in some building, then we actually know that it was there. So this is an established fact. And historical sources are very tricky because, for example, in the Middle East, there was this this habit of emperors. They put up large stones in their lands to glorify themselves and their great deeds that they have done for the country. And many of these things that are written on these stones are highly exaggerated, to say the least. So they say, yeah, there was a great battle and a great victory, but actually it was a defeat. But they just don't want to say this because they will look bad to their people. So it's just very complicated. And so sometimes there are stones that say it was a great victory, but actually the archaeological evidence is rather, it was perhaps a draw or perhaps a defeat, but it didn't really have any significance. So yeah, just to remain on my point, it's just not that easy to know what people meant or how things have to be read when you don't know the context of this society.
Well, I mean, some case, I agree that some cases they could be describing mythology or poetry, but in some cases it's clear that they are writing within a specific genre. And if there are things claimed in that genre of history that contradict other facts, well, we could say, well, he was exaggerating or lying. And when it comes to archaeological evidence, it's true that we have some, but it's far more limited than things we can know through written sources, because the archaeological evidence don't tell us much. And also, besides, there are archaeological evidence which is consistent with what the Bible teaches also, so that's mentioned. So when we look at the Bible, we see a very clear genre of historical biography. Even the very beginning of the Gospel of Luke makes it extremely clear that it's writing about history, trustworthy history based on trustworthy sources, and they're written by eyewitness accounts, etc. So it would be, within a historical lens, it would be very valuable and very trustworthy compared to other sources, which would perhaps not be so trustworthy.
Yeah, I will just, I don't know, restate my point again. That's why I thought this example with Thomas Aquinas was so valuable, that today people mean something different when they say science than Thomas Aquinas meant. And so why is it so, it seems to me entirely probable that people today mean something completely different when they say something is a historical fact than people meant 1,000 or 2,000 years ago, using the same word perhaps even, but meaning something different. And you can't just take the word out of the social context and be sure that you know what it means. I just don't think that that's a valid way of dealing with it. And so, yeah.
One could read the Bible and see the context and clearly see what is meant here and there. So when
No,
Jesus...
no, not the context of the Bible, but the context of society. It's like when someone today writes the word, when someone today says, this and that has been scientifically established. This has a certain meaning in the context of our society, because people have a shared understanding of what they mean, of what the term science means. This kind of context, I mean.
Well, yes, but we can take that into account and still gain knowledge about what it says. Just as I know that you would agree that there are facts about ancient history that we do know through certain sources and that we can know. It's not like if we took your position to the extreme, we couldn't know anything about ancient history, because who knows what they meant, but we can know in many cases.
Yes, I guess we have many statements which we have very good reason to believe that they are true. They are very highly probable true about past events. Yes.
Right, so we can know what they meant in many cases.
No, that
Like when Tacitus says there was a war here between the Romans and the Greeks or whatever. Well, it's clear, or between Sparta and Athens. We can know, okay, there was a war, and that's why people talk about the Peloponnesian War. Or
yeah, I guess that's on that level. I would agree. Yes.
right, and the concepts which, for instance, talking about giving sight to the blind and things like that, people understand what that means, and that
No,
meant
no,
what
no,
it means
no,
today.
no, no. That's not a valid transition. That's not what I mean, because giving sight to the blind is also can be understood very well metaphorically. This is an image that people might use to describe something, just like we said. Yeah, never mind the example, it will come to me later, but let's say a person is very confused in life and they don't have a perspective and they are doing very, very terrible in life. And someone helps this person get a good perspective on life and get their life in order, and afterwards they have a better life. Then you could easily say this person was blind, not in the literal sense with the eyes, but in a figure of speech kind of sense. And this other person gave them sight, so now they are able to walk through life in a better way.
Have you read the accounts in the gospel which talks about the incidents where Jesus heals the blind?
I'm not exactly sure. I have read the book of Matthew from start to end, and there were many examples of different miracles. I'm not sure if I have read the one you exactly mean, but yeah.
Because in those cases, it's very clear from the context and what is said that it's not meaning it in a metaphorical way, but in a literal way. The blind man who can see, and then Jesus's eyes, no hands, or yeah, there are different accounts, but it takes something above the eyes, and then he can see, and it's very clear from the context that it's a literal miracle.
And he kind of he spits on it, or he does something like that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think he takes clay upon his eyes, or eyelots, or what it's called, and then he can see, and he's joyful, and I can see you, I can something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I would interpret this more as being a remnant of ancient medicine, and perhaps also of some superstitions in the populations about demons and about sympathetic magic and these kinds of things, like sucking the bad spirit away from someone. And then yeah, I read this kind of account more in this way. And of course we have stories too in our culture. Like, you can take any fairy tale or any movie like Pinocchio or The Lion King or these kinds of things. Like, nobody believes that there was a lion who was talking like a human being, who interacted with zebras like they were the subject of his kingdom. Lions eat zebras, everybody knows that. But that's not the point of the story. The story is trying to convey a moral message to the audience, and the audience gets the moral message. And I think that the stories in the Bible have to be read in the same way. So just because it says there was a man and he was blind and Jesus did this and then he saw, that doesn't mean that that literally happened in reality. It's
Why
like,
not?
because I think it's a story. Like when it says Hansel and Gretel went into the forest and they threw breadcrumbs on the floor and then they saw a gingerbread house. I don't think this means that there was actually once upon a time somewhere in a forest a house built out of gingerbread. It's an image to convey a certain reality, which is hard to convey in scientific language. That's why it's conveyed metaphorically.
But in this, we can distinguish that due to genre, because here we're not talking about a once upon a time history like Hansel and Gretel, but rather this man Jesus existed and he went there and he did this and he met these Romans and he met these people and these Jews and the temple in Jerusalem. So it's very clear that there is an historical context. And yes,
Yeah, but
sorry.
No, sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you.
Right. So and also that would also show that, well, it's not metaphorically talking about Jesus giving sight to the blind. And I also found an example of that right now in the Bible, where there is said, and he took the blind man, and some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him, and he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and said, "I see people, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly, etc. So that would be an example of clearly a literal healing. And so it wouldn't be metaphorical. Now, it's technically a distinct issue whether that account is historically reliable or rather a once upon a time story. But it's clear from just analyzing the genre of the Gospels that it's talking about a biography of the life and teachings of Jesus in history.
Yeah, I'm not convinced that it is so clear as you think. Because why? Because I think it's quite, or the way I have come to look at these texts is that many different things are mixed together. So it's a mixture of historical account mixed with metaphorical knowledge about morality, etc., mixed with like how do you even call this, like self-identification as a group. This is all kind of mixed together in a very instinctive form of text. It's not the way we have these separate categories today, like this is a kind of a text about Swiss culture, and this is a text about Swiss history, and this is a text about moral norms in Switzerland. It's all kind of mixed together in a way that would intuitively make sense to the people in this culture. And so I think it's entirely probable or possible that there was a man named Jesus who went from one city to another in this time and this place. Yet the actions that are attested to him in this story sometimes are historical and sometimes are metaphorical and sometimes perhaps have some different meaning why they are in there, because people would just collect all the things that they subjectively felt are important and condense them into one story, which could be told from one person to another and actually remembered, because most people were still, I think, illiterate at that time, and they didn't have the time to read every day because they had to do manual work. And so you have to be able to tell them a story which they will be able to remember, which contains all of these relevant things together.
Well, that latter point would actually be in favor of the point that it is historical, because people would, of course, desire and wish to know what Jesus did in real life. But also, secondly, where's the evidence?
No.
Yes, of course. I mean, Jesus
No.
was literally whom they worshipped. Of course, they wanted to hear stories about what he did.
Yeah, but yes, okay. But the idea, like, I don't necessarily want to know everything that I don't know that any person did, even Jordan Peterson, who I really admire. I don't really care what he did this morning.
You don't worship him, not as a god.
Yeah, but people, yeah, but that's a difficult. It's difficult to tangle these things out of each other, because, as I have mentioned before, it was in pre-literate cultures, it was quite, I think it seems to me that it was common practice to keep the things from the past that were important by attributing them all to one culture hero and then worshiping this culture hero. So you could say to a person, you should be like Jesus, or try to be like Jesus, at least a little bit. And this would be a very fast way of conveying what the proper way of existing in this culture would be. And every culture has certain culture heroes, and some of them are not very refined, and some of them get refined more and more to the point where they are either sons of gods or actual gods. And I think it seems to me likely that this is the way people used stories in the past, because I would only remember a story if it was actually relevant to me.
No. I mean, that, of course, we remember stories that are not relevant to us. For instance, about some World War One, not particularly relevant to me, but we know that, Germany and Austria was on one side and England and France. I mean, of course, many people read history books about wars and other things that have no relevance. But other things, I don't see any evidence of what you're saying. When we read the Gospels, it's very clear that it's all an historical account. There is no indication anywhere that now it's talking about this metaphorical sense. It's rather very clearly historical narrative. There are some books in the Bible which does treat of poetry and things like that, but not the Gospels or letters of Paul or the Acts of the Apostles.
Yeah, well, I guess we will not get to the same page on this question. It's like in a science book today, it doesn't say this is a science book, and by science we mean this and that, and then proceeds to give a whole definition of science and the scientific method and how it is to be understood. This is held as common knowledge in our culture. So everybody knows when they look at the science book how they are supposed to read it.
Exactly, just as when we know the gospel accounts, we know this is history.
No, because the gospel was written 2,000 years ago,
so what?
And the culture today is completely different.
Some things are the same, for instance, describing historical events.
Yeah, but you can't just assume that what you mean when you say describing historical events is the same as what these people did, like we have seen with science. Thomas Aquinas didn't mean the same thing by science as we do today here in the West. So yeah, that's a good example.
There's a big difference between different terminology and ways of describing reality or describing historical events. I mean, of course, terminology has changed. Some words in the Bible, I mean, it was originally written in ancient Greek, in Koine Greek. So, of course, some terms are going to be different, but I mean, biblical experts have already taken that into account. So it doesn't create much of a problem at all.
Yeah, I still think it's, I'm not thinking we're getting any further in this. I mean, I have, for example, here, let me see, just one more try. Where is it now? I'm not sure exactly. I don't think it's this book, but this is a book about the legends of Hawaii. I think it was another book. There is a book about this very influential chief in Hawaii. He is called Kamehameha or something like that, and he was the one who united the 4 islands. But there are many other legends in here that describe how Hawaii was created, and so I haven't read all of it. I have read, I think, the story of this leader. He's even a historical figure because he used firearms that came from perhaps the British or the Spanish or something like that, and this helped him to unite his city, these 4 islands. But the point I'm trying to make is when people tell stories like this, it's not, I think it's not the best example. I'm mixing 2 things in my head. I can't separate them exactly, but you just can't assume that what you say historical description of reality and what other people do when they describe the past of their culture is the same thing. I just think it doesn't work. And of course, people in the West read books about the First World War or about historical events. But yeah, these are people in the West, and they write books according to their understanding of history, and then they read them. And that's what people in the West do. But that doesn't mean that every book which has been ever written about past events is written in the same style and in the same way of describing, has to be read in the same way. It just doesn't follow.
It's true that there can be various styles and of course legends occur and stuff, but still there are sometimes we see when it's not meant to be a metaphor or mythological issue, and I would say that is with the gospel genre. And also, I mean, if we were to take this principle to the extreme that we can't know for certain when they're actually describing true historical events, but again, then we can't know hardly anything about ancient history and almost anything. I mean, then we can't use Tacitus as a historical source about what happened in Rome and the Roman Empire. We can't use Plutarch. We can't use anyone, Josephus. All of those, we have to trash them in the cash bin when it comes to knowing about what actually happened back then. But no, of course, we can use some of what they say, actually a lot of what they say, because we see clearly when the context, analyzing the genre, that now they're describing real history. Plus, in addition, when it comes to certain things like the resurrection of Christ, there are clearly things that are said that makes it very clear that they're talking about a real event, such as the empty tomb. The empty tomb would make sense if it was merely a spiritual resurrection or psychological resurrection. The empty tomb only makes sense if the body actually is resurrected. St. Paul talks about if Christ did not raise from the dead, our faith would be meaningless. Well, that sounds like the faith is confirmed by the resurrection, but how can it be confirmed if it's merely analogical or spiritual? So there are many such facts which could be appealed to.
Yes, I guess perhaps this would be a good point to go over to my third problem that I mentioned very early on when you said this example of the 4 Catholic priests. And I mentioned also the problem of internal contradiction of the theory that is proposed. And so let's say for a moment, for the sake of the argument, that I do trust these sources and I would grant that your interpretation of them is correct and that these things actually happened in reality the way they are described, or also these accounts of your miracles, like the sun drying the clothes and all of these things, and these 4 priests survived this bomb. So let's say that this actually happened in reality the way we understand historical facts today. Then this would raise a very big question in my mind, and that would be, why would God choose to rescue 4 Catholic priests from an atomic bomb, for example, but let millions and millions of other people suffer terribly and die without any fault of their own every day or every year throughout all of history? How does this make sense? If he is to be all powerful and all good, then I just can't. It seems to me contradictory.
Well, we could say that when God performs miracles, it is to give us a message of some sort. And the message with, actually, I checked out, it's the Hiroshima 8, not 4. So there's actually 8 priests, not 4 priests. What was special about them was that they prayed the rosary daily. And the rosary in Catholicism is considered a very powerful means of gaining spiritual grace. It's a very, very powerful and an important spiritual devotion. So in a way, this miracle could be a sign from God how important and valuable and powerful the rosary is, which would then be used to show that people should pray the rosary because it's very important for a spiritual life. And of course, the spiritual life is by far the most important things in human life. It's far more important than the body, because the spiritual life concerns how to attain heaven, how to be saved, how to get closer to God and become virtuous. So it would make sense that God would perform miracles to send messages about the spiritual life. So yeah, and when it comes to, well, why can't God do more miracles like this, etc.? Well, again, we might not know exactly the reason why God makes this miracle at that particular date instead of another date, etc. But we have no reason to assume that we know better than God when he should and should not perform miracles. So there is no way you can prove that there is a contradiction there, because we cannot make a judgment about when it's reasonable and not to perform miracles.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's certainly true from within the axioms. It's not from within the axioms of Christian faith and of most other religions. It's not up to human beings to judge the actions of God. So I understand that point, but at the same time, the theory still isn't convincing to me, and it can be because I'm sinfully arrogant and trying to understand God's ways, but I'm really sorry, I just can't help it. I mean, and there are many ways I could go about your explanation. One question is, well, there are of course many other people who also pray the rosary who aren't being saved, not even in the sense of trying to convey a message to other human beings around them that they should be praying the rosary. I mean, if people would have realized that praying the rosary can improve your chances of surviving catastrophes, then people would be praying the rosary all the time. And
I wish.
You wish, yeah. Yeah, but you can also perhaps conclude from this fact that actually praying the rosary doesn't really improve your chance of survival. Now you would say that's not the point, because the point is about the spiritual survival and not the bodily survival. But again, then you could ask, well, if that is so, why are people then made that they desire bodily survival so much? Seems like a little bit.
Sorry, could you repeat the very last question?
Yeah, why are people then made to desire bodily survival so much when that's actually less of import? And yeah, I don't know. And perhaps you want to respond, or yeah, before I go on with 10 other examples.
Well, I would briefly say that there is an explanation for why we value bodily things, or are more inclined to care about the body than the soul. It has to do with original sin, the fall of man, concupiscence, etc. But anyways, a more important, deeper point is that you said that, well, within the framework of Catholicism, it makes sense to say that, well, we can't know the ways of God, etc. Well, the point which would be very valuable is that if we're talking about objections to Catholicism, like as I understood you were trying to come up with arguments which would reveal some sort of internal contradiction within Catholicism. But I would say that, well, you cannot prove that there is such a contradiction, because there are ways we could show that or point to how it couldn't, or how it can be reconciled. And you might say, well, that doesn't prove Catholicism, because again, you're just assuming that within Catholicism. True, but the point was simply to show that we don't see an internal contradiction. And therefore, even though we might say, well, we can't know exactly why God does this instead of this, it cannot be used as an argument to show that there isn't a contradiction within the worldview. So that was rather the point I was making.
Yeah, but still, it is a contradiction for me, and that's why I cannot come to the conclusion that this theory makes sense for me and explains reality for me. It might be that you have some way, or that Catholicism as a theoretical structure has an explanation, which is, yeah, you cannot know the ways of God, or you cannot judge him as man. But that's actually, as I have said before, that's an explanation for everything. You can explain everything with just saying, well, God is all powerful and you cannot judge his ways, and therefore that's the end of every argument. But for me, it's not convincing. I still have to ask, well, if God is all powerful and all good, then why is the structure of reality the way this is? It's just, I can't get around it. And even if the point of life were to pray the rosary every day, then why wouldn't there be miracles happening all the time so that everybody would get the message? And also, it wouldn't even be good if people started to pray the rosary just because they want to be saved from a nuclear blast, because then they wouldn't do it for the right reason. And so I guess that wouldn't even help anything. And so the whole theory just doesn't make sense in my mind. And yes, true, you have this explanation, well, you can't judge what God, when he performs what miracle. I get it, but it's not convincing to me.
Well, to say that we cannot judge God's action, well, that cannot be used as a philosophical explanation for absolutely anything, in the sense that that can solve logical contradictions. If God said Jesus Christ is God at one place, and then another place he said Jesus Christ is not God, then you would have a contradiction.
Well, actually, it could even explain this.
How?
Because you could just say, well, the one thing was to test the fate of man, or I don't know. You don't know his motivations for doing it, so how can you judge it?
No, the problem there is that it contradicts the nature of God to lie. So it is an impossibility. Just as
okay, let's accept it. Let's accept it. Why not?
Right. So then one would say, okay, is there such a contradiction within Catholicism? And there wouldn't be in the case of why didn't God do this instead of that? Because, I mean, when you talk about contradiction, it would be like, okay, here is one part of Catholicism claiming one thing, there's another part of Catholicism claiming another thing, and these two are mutually exclusive. They cannot be reconciled. So that would sort of be the critique, but I don't see that. Perhaps you meant that, well, there is one claim, that is God is all powerful, all knowing, and perfectly good, and then we know that there is evil and suffering and ignorance in the world, and these two can't be reconciled. Is that rather your argument, or is it another way you would frame your or formulate your objection?
I guess I have to formulate it differently, because then it will be easier. So I will not make a definitive statement whether or not there is an internal contradiction or not, but I would say these statements seem contradictory to me, and therefore the theory is not convincing to me.
Seem contradictory to you? Well, so in other words, would you say you are convinced that they actually are contradictory objectively? Otherwise, I don't know how I would understand you.
Am I convinced that they are contradictory objectively? Yes. Yeah, no. So in that sense, I wouldn't change my statement, I guess. You're right. I wanted to eliminate problems of this discussion, but no, I think the way I understand, Well, that's the problem. No, yeah. That's the problem when you mix statements like God is all powerful and good, and perhaps the contradiction is the following. On the one hand, you claim God has certain attributes and we can know that he has these attributes. And on the other hand, you claim God cannot be perfectly known by man, and we cannot understand why he chooses to do what he does. And these two things are contradictory.
If they are contradictory, then there must be some implicit assumption here that if God were all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good, he would necessarily give everyone perfect knowledge of himself. That would be the implicit assumption if there were a contradiction there.
No. The fact that you can even make the claim God is all good, and you must have, of course, some idea in mind of what you mean by all good, else it wouldn't be meaningful to make this statement, right?
Let's go with that.
Okay, let's go with that for the moment. So you have some actual idea of what it means to be all good, and you say God has this attribute. And then when I say, well, why are these people seeing a miracle and not these people? Which, in my mind, if God were all good, he should make sure that everybody sees enough miracles so that he understands whatever he needs to understand to be spiritually saved in your theory. Then you turn around and say, and not you, I mean you, but this structure of belief turns around and says, well, you cannot know the motivations of God, and you cannot judge how many miracles he should or shouldn't make. Right. But if you say that he is all good, and I can know that for certain, then actually I can judge how many miracles he should make, at least to a certain extent.
Why? So I can understand you better.
Because that would be implied by wanting the best for everyone, and the best being spiritual salvation. Then you should show people a lot of miracles so that they have a higher chance of coming on the right path and being spiritually saved instead of going to hell in your worldview.
So in other words, that the perfect goodness of God would mean that he would give us more grace or information so that we could be saved, for instance. That seems to be your assumption.
It sounds quite close. Yeah, let's say that's what I'm saying.
Right. It sounds very close to the problem of divine hiddenness, if you're familiar with that term. It sounds very, very similar to what you were saying.
Yeah, can you elaborate on that?
The problem of divine hiddenness is the argument that there are many people who don't have explicit knowledge of God. There are many people who are either agnostics, pantheists, atheists, etc. But if God exists and he wants everyone to be saved and have a relationship with them, then he would give them knowledge of his existence instead of keeping them in ignorance. But it does keep them in ignorance. Therefore, there is a problem with God as understood in Christianity. That is how I understand the objection there. So it seems to be a popular objection.
Yeah, I guess since we have started talking about miracles, and you have presented miracles as, because the purpose of the miracle is not to save this particular person, as far as I have understood you, but the purpose of the miracle is to convince all the bystanders and all the people who hear of this miracle that the teaching is actually true and they should adhere to it, because this will lead to their spiritual salvation, right?
Right, that is the end goal, you could say, in a way.
Yes, and then I would say, well, if God is all good, then he should make so much miracles that everybody gets the point and then is spiritually saved. Because why shouldn't he? He can if he wants to.
So here is one fact within Catholicism that I think is very helpful to understand why it is the way it is. It is that everyone everyone has the opportunity and availability of gaining sufficient evidence for God's existence and eventually ending up being convinced of the Catholic faith. So that a person who would be of goodwill and really seek the truth and etc. would eventually ultimately come to the knowledge of the truth. And that is also true in my experience for myself, since I used to be an atheist once, but I eventually came to the knowledge of the truth. So it's true that God could make it even more easy than it currently is to come to the knowledge of the truth, but it gives people still sufficient evidence for them to come to that knowledge of the truth on their own. Yes. So what do you think about that?
I think yeah, it just doesn't. I still think that that's a good. It doesn't fit together. So again, I have originally said that the contradiction which I think that I see is between people making certain statements about God, like God is perfectly good, and we have assumed for the sake of this argument that we can have some understanding what being perfectly good would logically mean. And on the other hand, saying things like we cannot know God's motivation, or God works in mysterious ways, or these kinds of things. Because, and now you have kind of, in my mind, this explanation that you have said, well, everyone has the opportunity to be convinced of Catholicism. That's just like a weaseling out of the contradiction that I have presented. So if we say God is perfectly good, and the most important thing for a human being is his spiritual salvation, and God has the means, or miracles are the means by which God tries to convince people of the truth of this particular belief compared to all other beliefs, then why shouldn't God make more miracles if that would help to save more people? It's just like when I'm walking on the road with my child, and my child all of a sudden wants to run away and there is traffic on the road, then I will immediately grab the child and not let it run away. I wouldn't say, well, I have grabbed you once a year ago, so you did have the opportunity to understand that you shouldn't run onto the road. It just seems like not what I would understand as being perfectly good, saying, well, you could have understood it, but you didn't, so now it's upon you. Well, no, why not try again so that he may understand it better?
Well, one could probably say a lot about that, but perhaps some things that can be said then would be that first, the issue of coming to the Catholic faith. There is this principle that the principle of merit. The idea is that if you do a good action with good intentions, that might bother you in some way, or implies some sacrifice in some way, but you do it for the sake of goodness and for God, then you would obtain merit, and that merit can be rewarded in heaven. If you are in a state of grace in Catholic theology. And if you come to the knowledge of the Catholic faith by means that are sufficient to bring you there, but you could have made it even easier, then God will take that into account, and your faith will be more meritorious because you come to the knowledge of the truth, even though it could be even more easier. So you come to the knowledge of the truth, even though it's less obvious than it otherwise could have been, but it's still sufficient for you to come there. It's a little bit like you are going on a race and you're supposed to finish the race and reach the goal. To run, well, that takes some effort, etc. But when you actually get to the end of the race, you'll be rewarded. So that's also why salvation is described as a race to the bottom, etc. So you could say that, well, God will sort of leave you challenges. So it will still be sufficient evidence for you to come to the truth, but you will still have perhaps the opportunity to resist certain doubts, for instance. So it's still sufficient evidence for everyone of goodwill, but it's not necessarily extremely obvious, similar to how a father could let his child have challenges to train himself to become better. It's a little bit like that, you could argue. Yeah, so that's one point one could bring up.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like this is always what happens in these kinds of discussions, that it just, there keeps coming something more and more, and it's like, you asked me where do I see the contradiction, and I have, I think, stated it more clear than I was able before now, because you have pressed me on it. So I think I have stated the contradiction quite clearly, and then there is always some other explanation, like, and I understand the concept that it's more merit if you have to earn something than if it's just given to you, in form of being a concept of human life. And I think it's a valuable concept, but that doesn't mean that it's a metaphysical truth. And I mean, if you talk about sufficient evidence, well, why do you need the Hiroshima 8 and the weird moving of the sun? I mean, if the resurrection of Jesus was enough and the historical account is good enough, then why do you need these other two miracles? So wouldn't it have been even more merit if these miracles didn't occur? So, and that's what I mean when I say that I think this whole theory is convoluted and full of contradictions in my mind. And that's not to say that these religions don't have value for human beings. I just think this way of looking at them doesn't really lead anywhere. And I don't also think it's, that's why sometimes I get a little frustrated with these kinds of conversations, because they're like, to use a little bit how do you say, a distasteful metaphor for you probably, it's a little bit like intellectual masturbation. It just goes on, and but I don't feel like it's giving me value in my life to have these sorts of intellectual exchanges, because I think it's quite obvious that there is a contradiction. And then whenever I address it with some religious conversation partners, there's always some other explanation why it's not a contradiction. And I just feel like the web is getting more and more entangled, and at some point I cannot keep up with everything. And then you say, aha, so it's not a contradiction, so it might theoretically be true. And so what? It's not convincing for me. It doesn't help me in my life. So that's a little bit the problem that I have with it.
Well, to address that, you said that it seems to you to be an obvious contradiction, but therein lies the problem. What is the basis for saying that there is a contradiction? And you have said that, well, God is perfectly good according to this idea, but he allows there to be difficulties or suffering, or that people are not given more evidence for its existence, etc. But the problem is, why is there a contradiction which you say is obvious? And you might have this assumption that, well, if God is perfectly good, he would necessarily give people a lot more information about his existence than he currently does, or he would alleviate this amount of suffering or whatever. The point is that, well, this assumption, there is no reason to have that assumption. And to the point you also mentioned that, well, why doesn't God give us less evidence of his existence? Well, God creates a certain balance between different concerns. You could say there's a hierarchy of preferences and values, etc., and God creates this set of balances. And it's also true that God desires our conversion, but it's also true, actually, in Catholicism, though this might be more politically incorrect, that God actually wills higher goods to some people than others. For instance, in Catholicism, the Blessed Virgin Mary is considered the best creature. She's the creature that God loves the most. So there is actually a difference in how much people God will give each one a good. He will give each one the opportunity to be saved, but he will make it easier for some compared to others. Now, of course, someone might ask, well, why? Well, God ultimately does this to glorify himself. That's what creation is about in a certain sense. It's to glorify himself in a sense. And the issue with all these theological explanations and theories and things that I've said is that there is no basis to say that there must be a contradiction between the perfect goodness of God and the world as we live in today. It seems to me that you always have this assumption that if God is perfectly good, then the world must have been otherwise. It must have been better than what it is. But where is the evidence for that being the case? So, and since you have sort of presented this as an objection against Catholicism, I would hope that you would reconsider that objection in light of that, because you know of the importance of this issue.
Yeah, no, that's the point. I mean, yeah, that's just the point. When you say God is perfectly good, then either I can have a chance of knowing what perfectly good means, or I cannot know what perfectly good means. And according to my understanding of what I would think to be perfectly good, this is not what I observe. Now you can say, well, you have the wrong understanding of what perfectly good means. Okay, but then if you start defining perfectly good in a way that in the end there isn't a contradiction anymore, then I would just have to say, this is not what I would mean by the term perfectly good. So then the first statement that God is perfectly good kind of becomes meaningless. It's like it's kind of like a tautology. It's you define God as perfectly good, and then you define perfectly good so that everything is just like it is now. But then why call it perfectly good? Because I have an intuitive understanding of what I would or would not consider perfectly good, and I can't just kind of twist that by a lot of logical arguments. It's just I believe that this word means certain things. And so, for example, I was thinking of this example as you were talking. If there is a man in the desert and he is dying of thirst, and I have a bucket of water, if I were perfectly good, I would just give him the bucket of water. I wouldn't kind of place the bucket of water perhaps 100 meters away from him and say, look, you will have to work in order to earn not dying of thirst, and then it will be more glorious because you had to work in order to get the water. That's not how I understand perfectly good. And you can say, well, I have the wrong understanding of what perfectly good means, or I should understand it differently, but I just don't. I'm sorry. So, and I have to rely on that words have a certain meaning, because else the whole enterprise becomes pointless.
Well, again, that's a deep issue, but one thing I could say is that the goodness of God is, we could indirectly or analogously understand it in terms of uh, virtues, for instance, like justice and prudence or love, etc. And you could say also that the goodness of God is, because of the goodness of God, his creation will be such that it manifests some goodness which reflects him. Again, very deep metaphysics here, but anyways, and you could say that, well, God, by allowing there to be certain amounts of suffering, etc., and merit, etc., that will reflect his goodness in ways that it wouldn't in other ways. So you could, and also the issue of a man saving another man who dies of thirst directly, instead of, if you know, instead of helping him in a sense of he is going to get that bucket. Well, um, it has to do with human beings, because of the position we are in, has to focus on certain goods, because because you could say it's a command from God to care about others, etc. But God is in a different position than us when it comes to what he will promote as good in relation to other goods. So that's perhaps the best answer I can come up with right now. But yes, the goodness of God is a very interesting subject, what that means, etc. But
Yeah, I guess kind of steering towards the end of this particular conversation, I guess it really comes down to there are different worldviews that are internally perhaps consistent, or people have within their worldview an explanation for challenges that come from the outside. And this wouldn't be any different with my own worldview, of course, but not everybody will find the same worldview convincing. And I don't exactly know why that is. I think that's an interesting question. But just also considering this whole conversation that we had, and also my general experience of life, I just don't think that this explanation that you are putting forward is the most convincing to me. I think it's more valuable to view religious teachings as metaphorical teachings that should help you act in the right way in material reality so that your actual life turns out well. That's just the way I understand it, and you have a different understanding, and that's okay. But yeah, I'm in some sense, I think these exchanges are valuable because you are kind of trying to look at one worldview through the eyes of another worldview and to criticize it, and that gives people the chance to improve their own understanding on whichever side of the argument they stand. But on the other side, I sometimes feel like these exchanges are a little bit futile. Because I'm not sure right now. We have talked long about this, and I had another friend here in Switzerland with whom I had a lot of similar conversations in the past. And I'm not exactly sure what you think is now the benefit of this time and effort that we have spent. What good comes out of it actually?
Well, I think it's a very valuable discussion, in a sense that the things we are discussing back and forth concern the most important things in reality. It concerns, does God exist? Does miracles happen? Is, for instance, the Catholic religion true? And that would entail, okay, is there an afterlife? Is there a heaven and hell? How should we live? it concerns all these most fundamental and deep questions. They're far more valuable than small talk about the weather or even some minor philosophical issues, because we're talking about the most important of all things, the most crucial of all things. So yes, I think the content of such a discussion is very important and valuable. And I think this discussion has been very interesting as well. And the experience I have of this is that we are trying to get at the bottom of the issues, the bottom of your objection and the bottom of what Catholicism is about, and goodness of God, for instance, the problem of evil. These are very famous objections against Christianity, and I think we dive into some very crucial matters here. So yes, that is my experience of it.
Yes, I think that's interesting actually right now, because I have just realized that depending on your worldview, you will find different things to be most important or very valuable. Because since I am, in the end, basically a materialist still, I think, I tend to think that philosophical conversations have value insofar as they lead to changed behavior in reality, like people developing virtues, people improving their lives, people improving their societies, or societies not degenerating and collapsing. That's what is most valuable to me, because I look at the world through this lens. And when you, of course, look at the world through your lens, then you will think that talking about the existence and goodness of God and spiritual salvation and these kinds of things is more important than the material things which I have described. And so perhaps that's where a little bit of the difference in experience comes from. Would you agree with that?
Well, the thing is also that the issues of is Catholicism true, does God exist, etc., also is extremely important with regards to the issue of how should we live, how should we behave, what kind of life should we live, what kind of society should we have. Because depending on whether God exists, etc., that will produce very significant answers for our life and the life of our society. And that's why Catholicism is also very important in social matters and, of course, in ethics as well. And I think you probably would say that, well, we should concern ourselves with that which will make us happy, that which will bring us happiness. You would probably agree that that is an extremely important issue to gain happiness, right?
Yes, but over all different time frames. So not just happiness in the present, but kind of long term. Yes, I guess, yeah.
Right. And one of the things about Catholicism is that to embrace the religion of God would and living in his grace would bring true happiness to the soul and peace in the soul that one would not otherwise have. And thus Catholicism would also be extremely important in regards to those things which you also said you believe are important.
I mean, I will grant that if the worldview that you are representing here would actually be correct, and I would be in error with the worldview that I am presenting, then it would actually be important to fix this error and to find this which is actually true, so that I have to agree with. And the problem is just that, to me, because of contradictions like I have mentioned and similar ones which I haven't expressed very well so far, it seems quite clear to me that the worldview you are representing is not the right one. I think my way of understanding these things is more convincing to me, and therefore I think that it's somehow a little bit I think like it's because Catholicism and other religions have very valuable things to offer to human beings, but I think we are kind of, this approach that we had in this conversation, I don't believe to be particularly valuable. It's like, I don't know, when you have something really valuable, like, for example, a microscope, which you could use to do many good things for human beings, but instead you just kind of use it as an object to stop the door from closing, then it's of course an extreme example. I'm not saying our conversation is on that level. That's not, but the point is, I feel there would be another way of looking at these questions or at these teachings of religions, which actually brings value to people in my mind, but the way we have looked at it in this conversation is not optimally aligned. So I think that's where a little bit of my feeling comes from, that it's sometimes I ask myself in the end, okay, what was now gained by all this effort?
Well, what was gained was a very interesting intellectual conversation, is what I would say. But I mean, perhaps you would say that you have this idea of a problem between the goodness of God and how reality is structured. But what I would say is that, well, one should challenge those assumptions on one hand. Is it really the case that the goodness of God must be such that he must alleviate this amount of suffering or ignorance, etc.? Or can we understand the goodness of God as creating a world that is in a certain way, because that glorifies God and reflects certain virtues and goodness, etc., that would glorify him in a way that is most pleasing to him? And that seems to me to be a way that we could talk about the goodness of God and the way reality is, without having this assumption that you have been talking about, that the goodness of God must mean this and that. And since we don't have to view the goodness of God the way you do, we therefore don't need and shouldn't have the objection that you have. And therefore, that would open the door more to Catholicism being true. And that is the most important. I mean, if either Catholicism is true or is meaningless, I would say. So I place special emphasis on that. So yes, that is what I would say.
I guess if I understand your point correctly, you would say I have kind of defined goodness in a human term. Like, how would I think another human would act in a good way? But if you would define goodness of God from the point of view of God, like creating this glorious creation that would be good, then perhaps the contradiction would go away.
Yes, there is a sense in which there is a difference, in that there's a difference between the relationship between a creator and creation and a human being towards a fellow human being, both being made in the image of God. So there is a different moral relationship between God and creation and human beings.
Yes, because God's motives would be on the level of God, whereas human understanding of goodness would be on the level of humans.
Or you could say that since God is the absolute sovereign creator of all things, he in a sense owns everything and has the absolute right to organize his creation however he wants. But human beings are not the creator of other human beings. We don't own them in the way God would do, and therefore moral obligations and etc. would be different, if that makes sense. And it does.
Yeah, just because you own something doesn't mean everything you do with it is good. But
no, that's true. I agree.
But I think I see your point, that as far as I understand it, I have defined goodness by human terms, And you could argue, well, it has to be defined by God's terms. I would then ask myself, okay, but then what relevance would this have to me as a human?
So the relevance would be that there isn't this, we don't have this reason to not embrace the Catholic faith. And it would open the door to actually seeing that the Catholic faith is true, is at least what I would say to that.
But wouldn't then a statement like God is perfectly good, if good cannot be understood in human terms but has to be understood in God's terms, would somehow just be a part of a statement like God is God?
Well, here comes the, sorry.
Is true, but what does it help me? Like,
well, we can have an indirect idea of what the goodness of God entails because we see certain limited senses of goodness in this world, like virtues, like prudence or justice. Those reflect the infinite justice of God. There is this idea of analogy of being. If you remember that concept, that the goodness of God is, or the goodness of things around us is analogous to goodness of God. So we can have some indirect idea of what goodness is because we see it in a very limited sense around us, but with God, it's on a higher level, a much higher level. So we can understand it, but rather indirectly, rather than directly. Only in heaven can one see goodness directly.
yeah, I don't want to go around the whole circle again, because I was just thinking, yeah, well, justice, I mean, justice in human terms, I think that's exactly part of my problem. When I say, why is this person saved and not this one? I think that's not particularly just. But then when you would say, well, justice according to God, and he owns the entire creation, and then again, I would say, well, then you just mean something completely different by justice. So yeah, I think for me, it's enough of this for the moment. Yeah, I think an interesting realization for me is really that it depends on your worldview what you find to be valuable or important in reality more than something else, I guess.
You could say that, but again, people can change their worldviews.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. Yeah, that's the interesting part of it. And so, how would someone, and I have changed my worldview too. That's the interesting thing. But how does that exactly happen? That's like, I don't know. It's almost like something outside of your consciousness that does the changing, which I would say we have, of course, the unconscious or the subconscious, which does a lot of things. So that's where I would look. But yeah.
Well, one can change one's worldview rationally or irrationally. If you change it without any good rational reason, then it is irrationally. But if you change it because you find good evidence that the new worldview is true, then that's a rational shift.
Every worldview, if it is sufficiently sophisticated, has internally an explanation for everything. So I don't think you can say my worldview is rational and no other worldview is rational.
Actually, you can, because there are things in reality which prove one to be true, which would necessarily mean that all the others are inconsistent with reality.
Yeah, I don't agree, because first of all, you don't perceive all of reality, you just perceive a small part. And secondly, you interpret what you perceive based on your worldview.
Not necessarily.
How can you perceive something without interpreting it?
If you see a tree, you can recognize this as a tree, regardless of what you think about metaphysics.
Yes, but your worldview doesn't simply consist of saying this is a tree. It consists of much larger structures.
That's true, but many parts of that worldview are divisible, in the sense that you can hold one thing without holding other things. And second, there is this idea that we have access to reality through our senses. Through our five senses, we get knowledge about the world around us, like Aristotle would say, and that is the source of knowledge, not we having a worldview and then imposing that. That's rather Immanuel Kant's view, and that's very wrong. It's rather evidence or knowledge comes outside into the senses, and then our reason makes that intelligible.
Yeah. I don't know. Of course, I agree that knowledge, that sense information comes in, and that we can perceive the existence of objects directly through the senses. But that's not the same thing as having a worldview. So, for example, you say there is a tree, therefore someone must have created this tree. But
Yes,
you don't perceive that someone must have created it. You just perceive there is a tree.
true, but that conclusion is rather a logical deduction or implication based on what you see. Just as when you see a house, you know that the builder must have built it.
Yeah, I'm too tired. We had enough of this for me for the moment. We have to get to an end.
Seems like we've been going on for 11, quarter past 11, I think we began, something like that. So 3 hours, 2 hours, 2
Yeah.
hours, yeah. Right, so to end it, I would say this has been a very interesting conversation, very productive discussion about very deep and interesting issues. I enjoyed the discussion, I would say. So yeah, we could leave it at that, and I will let you have the last word. And before that, I'll just say thank you to the audience who listened in or checked out this video. And I will then say have a good weekend to both you, Amos, and the audience, and you'll have the last word.
Yes, thank you very much. It was an interesting and also intense discussion. And as I have said, I'm kind of mixed about these kinds of discussions. I feel somehow they are valuable because you are kind of looking over the boundary of your own worldview, or you are looking at another worldview through external eyes, which might be very beneficial in order to find the truth. On the other hand side, I also tend to find these very deep discussions of these like religious ideas in the way that we had it today. I tend to find them not very valuable for my own life and for life or society or these kinds of things. And so I think I would enjoy it more to talk about these topics from another angle, but of course that's the angle that is coherent with my worldview, whereas the angle we took today was a little bit more coherent with your worldview. So I guess that's just, you can't escape the fact that you have a worldview and that it shapes what you find important or meaningful or valuable, or yeah, you can't escape that fact. And perhaps we could examine further in the future how people can shift from one worldview to the other. That might be interesting. But yeah, I think these are my thoughts on this entire conversation. I hope still some viewers will find it valuable, and I wish you and the audience also a great weekend.
Just a brief clarification from my side. When I said that we receive knowledge through the senses and then our reason makes it intelligible, I did not mean that reality is not intelligible in itself, but that our reason recognizes that, just so that people know. Okay, then goodbye.
Goodbye, everyone.